vote. I call the clerk.
Government business, notice number 2. National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024.
The call to the Minister for Communications.
I present the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024 and the explanatory memorandum.
Call the clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to amend the law relating to companies associated with the National Broadband Network and for related purposes.
The call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Speaker. I move that this bill be now read a second time. This bill reaffirms the Australian Government's commitment to ongoing public ownership of the National Broadband Network and to remove existing conditions that create a pathway to privatisation of this vital national infrastructure. The National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024, will amend the National Broadband Network Companies Act 2011 to recognise in legislation the government's policy that NBN Co Limited, the company that operates the National Broadband Network, remains in public ownership. The bill also makes minor consequential amendments to the NBN Act and to the Telecommunications Act 1997. In December 2022, the Minister for Finance and I, as joint shareholder ministers for NBN Co, issued an updated statement of expectations which confirms the government policy to keep NBN Co in public hands for the foreseeable future, providing the company with the certainty needed to continue delivering improvements to the network while keeping prices affordable. This bill strengthens that commitment and makes it part of the legislative framework. This change will remove the existing legislative conditions which, if satisfied, enable privatisation of NBN Co. The NBN was established by the Labor government because of the failure of the former coalition government to foresee and plan for the digital transformation of the economy. The sale of Telstra by the coalition sold out communities, particularly in rural and regional Australia, both in terms of critical infrastructure investment and service quality for consumers. Crucially, the Telstra sale also deprived the government of strategic levers to drive the investment necessary for Australians to fully access reliable high-speed broadband and the productivity and digital inclusion benefits that delivers. That is why it remains vital that the ongoing mission and focus of the NBN to deliver affordable, accessible, high-speed broadband to all Australians be guided by the public interest rather than the commercial interests of a privileged few. We will retain strong regulatory oversight of the pricing of NBN wholesale products by the ACCC, and the government will continue to act in the interests of regional communities to narrow the digital communications divide. The NBN is Australia's digital backbone, carrying the majority of the download traffic for Australian households, and the NBN also carries a significant proportion of voice traffic for consumers. It is critical for this national infrastructure to be reliable, resilient and secure. In a time of rising risks of cybersecurity, we will ensure that the NBN stays in the ownership of the Australian people. The NBN reaches over 12.4 million premises across Australia. Currently, more than 8.6 million homes and businesses in Australia are connected to the NBN. The government has been making ongoing investment in the NBN to bring the benefits of high-speed broadband to more Australians. This government's support includes a commitment of $2.4 billion to replace the deteriorating copper network with fibre, which provides 90% of Australians, around 10 million premises in the NBN fixed-line footprint, with access to faster and more reliable broadband. This investment is already delivering benefits with increased reliability, fewer faults and access to higher speeds. In addition, the government and NBN Co are delivering a $750 million investment to upgrade services in the NBN fixed wireless network, which has flow-on benefits to NBN satellite services. This investment has already delivered uplifted speeds on existing plans and has introduced new fixed wireless high-speed tiers, with wholesale peak download speeds that range from 200 megabits per second and up to 400 megabits per second. The upgrade has also enabled unlimited data to be introduced for NBN satellite plans, with download speeds of up to 100 megabits per second. The NBN is vital nation-building infrastructure, essential to the well-being, safety and prosperity of Australians. An NBN that provides fast, reliable and affordable connectivity is critical to Australian households and businesses having access to key services to drive productivity growth, support digital inclusion and equitable access. Keeping NBN Co in public hands will ensure the company has the certainty necessary for its investment planning and operational decisions that are needed to maximise the economic and social benefits of the NBN. This is in contrast to a privately owned NBN Co that would be focused on maximising the profits of its owners and not have strong incentives to make the investments needed to keep prices affordable and connect Australians in regional and remote Australia, including First Nations communities. The NBN Act currently sets out conditions that, once satisfied, would enable a future government to initiate privatisation of the company. Once these conditions are met and a sales scheme completed, there would no longer be whole public ownership of NBN Co. Since the government has no intention to sell the NBN, there is no requirement for a legislative sales scheme. Other government business enterprises, for example Australia Post, do not have provisions for sale in their enabling legislation. This bill removes that pathway to privatisation and commits to keeping the NBN wholly owned by the Australian people. A new Section 43A will be introduced in the NBN Act to make clear Parliament's intention that NBN Co would remain wholly owned by the Commonwealth. It is proposed that the bill will commence on the day after the royal assent. Importantly, the amendments proposed by the bill are largely mechanical in nature and do not change the operations of the NBN. These are proportionate and balanced amendments consistent with the government's policy to keep the NBN in public hands. The proposed new statement of parliamentary intent would, in recognition of the national significance and nationwide accessibility of the NBN, further reaffirm the importance of NBN Co remaining in public hands and safeguard Australia's long-term economic and security interests. Through this bill, the National Broadband Network Companies Act 2011 will be amended to remove conditions enabling a future government to privatise NBN Co. These changes reinforce in legislation the government's commitment. The bill provides certainty to stakeholders, including broadband consumers, the wider telecommunications industry, broadband retailers and NBN Co, that the Commonwealth will continue to retain ownership of NBN Co. This certainty supports the government commitment for NBN Co to provide high-speed and reliable broadband connectivity for Australians. I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the Member for Banks and Shadow Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, what a sad little stunt this is. This has a real last days of empire feeling to it, Deputy Speaker. Government's getting desperate, it's getting hammered in basically all directions, and so they think, let's try to come up with some distractions so that people look over there. Don't look at what this government is doing on a daily basis and the catastrophic failures that it is putting onto the Australian people. Don't look at that. Look at various distractions. And the government just moved a suspension of standing orders to say how urgent it is that we debate this matter right now. Odd then that in the entire 2.5 years since the election, the Prime Minister's only mentioned the NBN in this parliament 6 times, which suggests that it hasn't been an overly urgent issue in his mind until then. And it's also interesting, isn't it, when we think about other policy areas, Deputy Speaker, and other policy areas in the communications portfolio. Now, you might have heard, Deputy Speaker, there's been something of a debate about the regulation of gambling advertising in Australia. And many people who will be listening or watching today would be aware that for a very long time this government has failed to act on the recommendations of the parliamentary inquiry into gambling advertising and other gambling measures. And in fact, that inquiry reported, what is it now, Deputy Speaker, some 16, 17 months ago. And what have we heard from the government in response to this issue? Nothing. Nothing at all. The only thing we hear from the government is that a response on gambling advertising is imminent. Imminent. And look, we're going to have to consult our Oxford Dictionary, Deputy Speaker, because perhaps the definition of the word imminent has to change. Because if something is imminent and it takes 16, 17 months, then the dictionary must be kind of wrong, Deputy Speaker. So it is comical, Deputy Speaker. There are so many people that want clarity from the government on this issue of gambling advertising. And of course, Deputy Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, back in May 2023, he stood at this dispatch box and you know what he did? He said something with commitment. He said that the coalition would ban gambling advertising from 1 hour before the start of a live sporting event till 1 hour after. And why did he do that? Because he believes it's the right thing to do. Yeah. Because he believes that gambling advertising is being integrated with sporting content in a way which is very bad for our nation. And this is a very important point, Deputy Speaker, because in this portfolio, there is this atmosphere of indecision and malaise. And we see it most comically on gambling advertising, but we see it on other areas as well, of course. We see it in relation to the News Media Bargaining Code, Deputy Speaker.
I'm just going to remind you of bringing your thoughts back to the bill before the House.
Certainly. Well, I think it's very important, Deputy Speaker.
You're 4 minutes in, so I'm keen to hear about the bill before you, the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment Commitment.
Very happy to do that, Deputy Speaker. So this proposal, as I say, it's the sort of thing when you are that you put forward when you're completely out of ideas. And the government's proposal is to change the 2000 law related to the ownership of the NBN. And of course, that's law that came into place when Labor was in power. So this is Labor's law that they are seeking to change. The Prime Minister back then, of course, was a Cabinet Minister. He was the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. He was a Leader of the House. And it's his law that he is now seeking to change, and is now saying that he seeks to urgently change, despite not acting on so many other areas of policy. And we haven't been briefed on this law as yet, Deputy Speaker. That's going to happen, I believe, later today. So we'll respond in the usual way once we've reviewed the legislation. But what this is about, Deputy Speaker, is an attempt to distract from the catastrophic failures from this government relating to many things, including the NBN, Deputy Speaker. Yeah, it's one of many. Because when we look at the NBN, we have this quite extraordinary situation where the government has cheered on price rises for the NBN that have absolutely smashed Australian consumers, Deputy Speaker. We saw an extraordinary situation earlier this year where 6 million families have been hit by this government with massive NBN price rises. Now, first they were hit in November 2023 and again in July 2024. And the government might welcome those price rises. In fact, they do welcome the price rises, because the Minister for Communications infamously described the decision that led to those price rises as great news for consumers. So it's in the press release. It's in the press release. Very hard to unwind now. The minister described it as great news for consumers, price rises of 14% for people who use NBN products, Deputy Speaker. And you know what else, Deputy Speaker? The people who suffered the greatest price rises under this government are the people who are on the lowest cost, most affordable plans, the people who can afford those price rises the least. And so what we saw back in November 2023 was an initial price increase. Then we saw in July of 2024 another price increase. And so in total, price increases of 11 to 14% in just 8 months under this government. And the bottom line, Deputy Speaker, is how are people supposed to pay for it? How are people supposed to pay for it? How are they supposed to find the money for those additional NBN price rises? But that's what they have to do, because under this government, that is what has happened. And so this government should apologise for those price rises and apologise for enthusiastically welcoming those price rises and describing them as great news for customers. But that's just one of many things that are going so terribly wrong when it comes to the NBN, Deputy Speaker. Under this government, we have seen a collapse in the satellite business of the NBN. People are literally running away from the NBN product because it is so bad. Like, that is what is happening, Deputy Speaker. So when this government came into power, there were about 120,000 people who subscribed to the NBN satellite product. Now that's down below 85,000 people. So they've seen a massive loss of customers, and at the same time, Deputy Speaker, the Starlink product, the competitive satellite product, which had virtually no customers 2 years ago, now has more than 270,000 customers. And what is the government's response? It's to convene a roundtable of academics to discuss the issue, Deputy Speaker, because this is a government and this is a minister that never met a roundtable they didn't like, Deputy Speaker. The atmosphere of indecision, of malaise, of failing to take action to stand up for Australian consumers is on very proud display when it comes to the NBN. And we're also seeing a further deterioration in the financial position of the NBN. So in the last 12 months, Deputy Speaker, the NBN's cash outflow was negative $1.4 billion, negative $1.4 billion, $300 million worse than the $1.1 billion negative result in the previous financial year under this government. So things are getting worse and worse. The prices are going up. Satellite customers are leaving. And you know who else is leaving the NBN, Deputy Speaker? People who live in existing homes, so what they call the brownfields customers. People who live in normal homes, they are leaving the NBN. And one of the big reasons that they're leaving the NBN is because prices have gone up by so much under this government. And this is happening in the middle of the Albanese government's cost of living crisis. So it's not only the NBN prices are going up, everything's going up. So since the election, people have seen the cost of health go up by more than 10%, the cost of education by more than 11%, the cost of food by more than 12%, electricity 14%, housing's gone up by 13%, rents have gone up by 16%, financial products and insurance have gone up by 17%, gas has gone up by 33%, fruit and vegetable prices have seen their highest rise since December 2022. So what the government should be doing is urgently bringing forward measures to address the cost of living crisis that Australians are dealing with at the moment. But do they do that? No, they don't. They don't do that. They don't bring forward something to address that issue. They bring forward to address an issue related to the ownership of the NBN, despite having basically never spoken about the issue in Parliament in the entire 2 years that the government has been in position. So it is an extraordinary failure, Deputy Speaker. And if you look at the communications portfolio, it is notable, Deputy Speaker, that the government seeks to bring on a debate on this issue, but what about the media bargaining code? What about the fact that Australian media companies have been absolutely smashed by Meta's withdrawal from paying for the intellectual property of Australian media? And on the 1st of March, 7.5 months ago, the Minister for Communications stood up and said that she and her colleague, the Assistant Treasurer, had made their expectations clear to the media companies that this was just unacceptable and that the government would be taking firm action. Well, that was 7.5 months ago. And what's happened since? Nothing. Except, I tell you what has happened, large-scale job losses in the media industry. We've seen very substantial job losses, and the minister might not think that's important, but I do. I do think it's important. We've seen very substantial job losses at 7 West Media, at 9 Entertainment, at Associated Press, at News Corporation. And those groups have all made very clear that a key part of the reason for those job losses is the refusal of Meta to pay under the News Media Bargaining Code administered by this minister. So does this minister bring a proposal to this government to actually solve that problem? No.
All the wrong priorities.
The government doesn't do anything on that issue, which is so fundamental to the Australian media sector, despite the clear powers existing in the News Media Bargaining Code. The government does absolutely nothing about that, but seeks to artificially bring on a debate about the ownership of the NBN, despite never talking about the issue in 2 years. So it's kind of sad, transparent, pathetic as a political tactic, Deputy Speaker. And that's why Australians have worked this government out, Deputy Speaker. And they've worked this Prime Minister out. They've worked out that he doesn't stand for anything, that he's weak, that he's indecisive, that he's presiding over a cost of living crisis which is smashing the average Australian family. Record insolvencies today. And so the human cost of this government's inaction is very disturbing, very disturbing. And that's what the government should be trying to address. But what the government instead does is put on a sort of confected display to seek to have a debate about the ownership of the NBN, despite the fact that a long time, back in 2021, the government said that the NBN would be kept in public hands, and this is not an issue which is new. This is not an issue which is urgent. This is an issue which is designed simply to bring forward a political debate. But that's not going to prevail, Deputy Speaker, because people are smarter than that. People have seen through this government. They know that this government is desperate. They know that this government is weak, it's indecisive, it's presiding over some of the worst cost of living conditions Australians have ever seen. And rather than responding to that, rather than bringing forward something to deal with these measures, the government does this. And you do have to ask, Deputy Speaker, of the Minister for Communications, why doesn't the Minister for Communications bring forward anything about gambling advertising? It's a very serious question. Why doesn't the Minister for Communications address this issue? I mean, she can't say that she's not aware that it's an issue of public concern. She can't say that it's an issue that worries Australians, and she can't say that it's an issue that she's not had plenty of time to address. but she can't bring forward anything on that. She brings forward a piece of legislation which is not urgent in order to simply have a confected political debate. We'll review that legislation once we've been briefed on it. But what we will never, ever do is behave in the fashion of this government of presiding over a shocking cost of living crisis, of being weak and indecisive, of failing the Australian people, of putting politics before the substance of assisting Australians. That's something we will never do, Deputy Speaker, and this government should and must be held to account for its shocking failures.
So the question is the bill be now read a second time. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the Shadow Minister, just in a 17-minute speech, failed to talk about the National Broadband Network. And it's not surprising because their record is so shocking when it comes to it. But he also had the temerity to suggest that what the government should be doing is cost of living measures. Cost of living measures that have been brought forward by this government have all been opposed by the opposition of which he is a part of. We brought forward measures to give tax cuts to all Australians. They said there should be an election over it. We brought forward energy price relief. They opposed it. We put caps on gas and coal prices. They rejected it and said that that was command economy and taking over from where the market should be left alone. We brought forward cheaper medicines. They said it would ruin the pharmacy industry.
Parliamentary remark. I'd ask him to withdraw.
I did not hear anything. I'm sorry. The interjections I heard from you earlier on, but I didn't hear. Is there any reason for the member for McEwen to withdraw?
Thanks, Madam
Okay.
Speaker.
Prime Minister has the call.
We brought forward cheaper childcare measures, opposed by those opposite. And this legislation is also about the cost of living, because it's about making sure that the National Broadband Network can stay in public hands, not be a for-profit provider that would have, by definition, an obligation to its shareholders, not the Australian people, but its shareholders, the people who buy shares on the stock market, and therefore obligated to maximise their profits, which means, in particular, for people in regional Australia and people in less dense areas, it means that those people would suffer, just as we had to deal with the consequences of the privatisation of Telstra. One of the reasons why we put the National Broadband Network in public hands is because we didn't have a communications provider in the public sector to be able to roll out broadband, high speed, to deliver for Australians, regardless of where they live. Now, the National Broadband Network is a vital national asset, and it delivers an essential public service. It was built by Australians for Australians, and it belongs to every Australian citizen, and it belongs in public hands. That's what this legislation is about. Safeguarding the future of the NBN, making sure it cannot be privatised, it can't be hollowed out, it can't be sold off to overseas interests, and making sure that every Australian, whether they live in the city or in the regions or in the outer suburbs, can count on the affordable, reliable and fast internet that they need and that they deserve. Publicly owned, affordable for all. Madam Deputy Speaker, or Mr Speaker, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam once said that his definition of equality was every child in Australia having a quiet room to study in and a desk with a lamp to read by. That was in the 1970s. In 2024, every Australian child needs to be sitting at their desk with access to the NBN. That's true for school, for TAFE, for university, and every household needs it too. The NBN makes telehealth possible. It makes working from home possible as well. I remember being in the electorate of the member for Richmond, where
the member for Banks will cease and desist.
Where health services being delivered, making an enormous difference, something that was written off by the coalition, who argued that it was all about videos and watching videos. It's about delivery of services, health services, education services, wherever people live. It connects us with loved ones interstate and overseas. It brings together communities of faith. It enables Australians to launch a start-up or take their small business idea to a national market. It's what farmers and growers and producers use to monitor weather, soil, feed and water. It helps secure our supply chains, transport, freight and logistics. It supports our national security infrastructure, our banking system and our energy grid. In every facet of our dynamic, outward-looking economy, in every element of our modern society, the NBN is fundamental to the way that we work, the way we learn, the way we trade and the way that we communicate. And it's critical to our economic growth as well. A faster, better NBN will contribute $400 billion to GDP by 2030. And that's why our government has invested $2.4 billion to bring full fibre NBN to an additional 1.5 million homes, including 660,000 in rural and regional centres. We're bringing free Wi-Fi to remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the continent. We're helping 30,000 families with children in school with a free internet connection. I visited one of those schools in the minister's electorate, and it's making such an enormous difference to those children in Western Sydney who would be without were it not for the commitment that the government has made. From next year, broadband speed will be up to 5 times faster at no extra cost. And today, what we are doing, Mr Speaker, is acting to safeguard the NBN for the future. Since 2011, if a government wanted to sell the NBN, there were 4 steps they would have to take. In 2020, the Liberals took the first step. They declared the NBN was complete. Job done, they said. Never mind the millions of households that were stuck without fibre or decent service. They wanted to get step 1 done. And then in 2022 they tried to jack up wholesale prices for high-speed broadband so every Australian would have to pay more. All about fattening the pig for market day. Very similar to what occurred with Telstra under the former government. Now, the ACCC rejected that attempt, but we know that this risk remains because there's never been a public service or a public asset that the coalition didn't want to flog off. It's in their DNA. And because when the Leader of the Opposition is looking around for the billions that he needs in the lead-up to PFO and beyond, he will be able to, of how he will fund these nuclear reactors, the most expensive form of energy, when he looks at the $315 billion of expenditure that they say is waste. Cuts to the pension, cuts to Medicare, cuts to wages won't be enough to cover all the costs, the sacking of public servants. He will look towards selling the NBN, selling a service that virtually every Australian uses to build nuclear reactors that will provide less than 4% of our energy. And the Liberal Party won't care that there are no Australian buyers. They'd be happy to sell off this national asset and sell out the national interest in a heartbeat. Because for those opposite, it's always the same. Let the market rip, and if people are disadvantaged, miss out, well, so be it. So be it. Remember, their model was that those who could afford the best speeds could get the best speeds, because everyone else just wanted to watch videos faster, just wanted that. So we will make sure with this that people, particularly in regional and rural Australia, are looked after, because the advances that are made in health and agriculture, in small business, in education, in emergency communications are too important to be put at risk. Our government is fixing mobile black spots in the bush that were left by those opposite. A privatised NBN would create internet black holes. Mr Speaker, in 2008 I was proud to introduce the legislation into this House that created the National Broadband Network. I am proud, as Infrastructure Minister, to do important work along with the Minister for Communications, Stephen Conroy. We couldn't know that a once-in-a-century pandemic would make remote work and remote learning a necessity for millions overnight, which it did. We didn't know at that time that machine learning, cloud computing and AI would drive exponential demand for faster internet speeds. But we did know that high-speed broadband would be critical for a stronger economy and affordable broadband would be crucial for a fairer society. And remember this, those opposite opposed at every level the creation of the National Broadband Network. They regarded it as waste, they regarded it as unnecessary. They regarded it as some obscure technology thing out there that was about watching videos. Now, Tony Abbott, of course, the former Prime Minister, these days known as 50% of the Leader of the Opposition's brains trust, along with his former Chief of Staff. This is what he had to say in 2013. Do we really want to invest $50 billion worth of hard-earned taxpayers' money in what is essentially a video entertainment system? Wow. That was the approach of those opposite. They pledged to rip up Labor's fibre broadband network, which they did. They said the maximum internet speed a household would ever need would be 25 megabits per second. Now, next year, households across Australia will have access to broadband up to 80 times faster than that. That's how quickly technology overtakes you, when you're stuck in the past and afraid of the future. That's how foolish and frightened the Liberals always look when they try and drag the rest of Australia back to the past just to keep them company. The Liberals wasted a decade turning their back on a first-rate fibre network that was already being rolled out, and they instead went out and bought 60,000 kilometres of copper, enough to wrap around the entire planet 1.5 times, to build a slow, third-rate network that was out of date before it was operational. Now, they said it had cost $29.5 billion, then $41 billion, then $49, then $51, then $58 billion, derailing progress to impose the wrong technology that was out of date and redundant before it was built, signing the country up for something that took longer to build and delivered a less reliable and more expensive service, and inflicting massive cost blowouts in construction. If this sounds familiar, imagine trusting this mob into building nuclear reactors. You know, they couldn't build car parks next to train stations for commuters, that they would have you believe that the mob that thought copper was better than fibre in this century wants to be trusted to build nuclear reactors. Now, Mr Speaker, our government is committed to an NBN that provides fast broadband that every Australian can afford, and that means an NBN that every Australian owns. This legislation is our promise to all Australians and our guarantee. Under Labor, the NBN will be affordable, it will be reliable, it will be fast, and it will be safe in public hands. And I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the honourable Honourable Member for Casey.
Thank you, Speaker. Well, we finally had the question answered of why we had to rush this bill forward, why it's been given and placed in the House 2 hours before the Shadow Minister's briefing, and we need to go through the timeline of the last 24 hours to understand why the PM just stood on his feet to give that speech. So we saw yesterday in question time a disgraceful personal attack against the Shadow Treasurer, an insult to many and everyone in the disability community, and many in the disability community are outraged rightly about the attack that the PM made yesterday on the Shadow Treasurer. We didn't hear anything from the Prime Minister until—
the member for Casey.
I'm about to link it to this bill.
It's not about linking. You need to talk about the bill.
I'm about to talk about the bill and why the bill has been brought forward today and been rushed today. And the reason it's been rushed is so the PM could stand there and talk about it right now. But yesterday, when he came in at 7:59, he didn't have support behind him. He was very happy to scurry in, but we had to rush it forward to create a distraction for the PM. And the reason we know that it was there to create a distraction was in the words of the Minister for Communications herself. This is a complete stunt, a complete distraction, because in the words of the Minister for Communications, in her speech, and I quote, "The bill will not change the operation of the NBN. It's not going to make any changes to those members of my community that can't access the NBN. It's not going to make any changes to the NBN for those victims of the June storms of 2021 that went months and months and months without their NBN because the operation wasn't up to speed." And that's why the timing is relevant, because there is nothing in this bill to improve the performance of the NBN. There is nothing in this bill to help the community of Casey, in the Dandenong Ranges, in the Upper Yarra, in the Yarra Valley, that are struggling with their NBN. And it's silence from the government on that. But they will rush this bill through. They will rush this bill through so the Prime Minister can stand at the dispatch box and talk about his legacy and the NBN to distract from his disgraceful actions yesterday. That is why he was standing at that dispatch box. That is why this has been rushed through. Pure politics, pure spin, because in the Minister's own words, this is not going to change the operation of the NBN. And my community, we know the NBN is not delivering as it needed to. Just recently, at the Kallarama Chestnut Festival in the Dandenong Ranges, the NBN dropped out completely. Every trader was not able to use tap and go to collect money, and even worse than that was the danger it created with communications not being accessible, phones not being accessible. And the Dandenong Ranges is a dangerous area. It's a dangerous area for bushfires. It's a dangerous area, as we know, for storms. We've had 3 storm events in the last 18 months, directly impacting the communications of our residents, including the NBN. So it is an insult to my community that the government will rush this bill through, even though it will not, in the Minister's own words, change the operation of the NBN, all to give the PM a platform to distract from his actions yesterday. Amazing that he can get everyone in the chamber today for his speech. Couldn't get anyone in the chamber last night when he came to apologise to those with disabilities and their families. Says a lot. Says a lot. Who can come in when there's a stump speech to give, and who turns up when there's an apology to give?
You were warned about the relevance matter by the Speaker just minutes ago. I bring you back to the subject of the bill.
Straight back to the NBN. So let's look at NBN. Talking about the Prime Minister, talking about how great the NBN. Well, it's not great for my community. The prices are up 14% since October last year. 14% since October last year, and the Prime Minister doesn't want to impact on the operations of the NBN. But let's have a look at the NBN satellite. Let's look at the performance of the satellites, the NBN. What are consumers telling us about NBN satellite? 85,000 people have taken up satellite through NBN. What are the other options? What are they saying? How do consumers react? Starlink. Starlink's another satellite option. How many people in Australia have taken up Starlink? 270,000 Australians have chosen to take up Starlink. So people are speaking with their money and with their feet. It is clear. I mean, if you're the minister, you're the Prime Minister, and you look at those results, it pretty much tells you there's an issue there. But we're not looking to make operational changes. We're just looking to have a stump speech and a bit of political spin. But then we get the Prime Minister passionately defending the NBN and its public ownership. Needs to stay public. And again, he then don't think he quite even understood what he was doing, because in the same speech he then spoke about nuclear energy. He then spoke about nuclear. But the Prime Minister has stood at that dispatch box time after time, in question time, criticising the opposition because we want to invest in the energy system, an essential service, the same essential service that the Prime Minister talked about. He talked about how important NBN was as an essential service, and I agree with him on that. So it needs to be publicly owned NBN as an essential service, but we can't have publicly owned energy. We can't have an energy system that is reliable. Why not? The complete lack of logic in the Prime Minister's own words should concern every Australian. It should concern every Australian that supposedly it is vital we have public ownership of the NBN. Vital, because it's an essential service, which I agree with. But it's not vital that we have a strong, reliable electricity network underpinned by the only technology that is zero emissions, reliable baseload power, backed by many people, including the former chief scientist Alan Finkel. And what that shows is this is all about ideology. It's not actually about a fundamental belief in anything. This is the challenge with this Prime Minister and this government. They don't stand for anything. They don't believe in anything. They're prepared to spin their performance. They're prepared to say what they need to say, trying to ride both sides of the fence. We just saw it then. We've seen a PM under pressure that is looking to distract. We've got a minister that is rushing through a bill that has no change to the operation of the NBN, yet for months and months we've been waiting for a response on gambling reform that sits in the minister's portfolio. Last year, the opposition leader, in his budget in reply speech, committed to banning gambling ads during sporting events and an hour before and after. And that legislation could have been through this House already. Families would be able to watch sport with their families without having to have gambling ads if the minister and the Prime Minister wanted to act. Now, they said at that time that they couldn't act because they needed to finish the Murphy report and they wanted to see that. And we're now months and months and months from a response on that. So it's this juxtaposition that we have of a minister and a government that are suddenly prepared to rush through legislation that is symbolic, legislation that makes no changes at all, doesn't improve the operations of the NBN, doesn't bring prices down for the community, doesn't improve reliability for my community, for regional communities. It does none of that. But we've got to rush it through because it's symbolic. And in many ways, this bill sums up everything that is wrong with this government. It sums up the political spin. It sums up the political spin of a government that is making it worse for the Australian people. They're not making a tangible difference. 2.5 years in, there's not one Australian that's feeling better today than they were 2.5 years ago. A Prime Minister that promised he had solutions to the cost of living challenges that the Australian people faced. He promised that in May of 2022. He hasn't delivered on that because there's not an Australian that's feeling better. A Prime Minister that promised energy bills would be reduced by $275, and they've gone up significantly in that 2.5 years. And the reason that this bill is symbolic of that is the reality that you can't spin your way out of the challenges the Australian people face. You can't bring a bill in that makes no difference and think that the lives of the Australian people are going to be improved. And I can understand, I've got a little bit of empathy for the Prime Minister in the sense that he's been in this House since 1996. He spent his whole life here. This is what he knows, this is what he understands. And the Treasurer brags about being involved in delivering 18 budgets, either as a Treasurer or as a staffer or as an MP. So I can understand why I'm sure they genuinely think that a bill like this makes a difference. I'm sure he does, but it doesn't. Unless you are delivering on the root causes that the Australian people face, you are not going to solve the challenges that we face. We've seen it with energy, we've seen it with interest rates, we've seen it with housing, we're now seeing it with the NBN. This bill, it makes no difference. It makes no difference for the Australian people. It will not improve the performance at all. Yet the Prime Minister of this country deemed it so important that he speak on a bill that makes no tangible difference to the Australian people, that he came down from his office and sat here and he mandated that every member of his team turn up and sit in the back so he gets a good camera shot. They needed the great optics of the Prime Minister standing at the dispatch box with everyone behind him. Instead of talking to constituents, doing the work they were here to nod heads for the Prime Minister on a bill that, in the Minister's own words, will not change the operations of the NBN, will not improve the services for the residents of Casey, will not improve services for the Dandenongs, will not help those businesses that lost so much money in Kalorama. And this is the frustration that we feel. It's all the spin. We can get everyone together for the spin. 2.5 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to meet with what we refer to as the captains of the hill up at Kalorama. There was the Mount Dandenong Kalorama CFA, there was the Ferny Creek Sassafras CFA, Alinda CFA were represented as well. We spoke to the Callista CFA about the communications challenges that they face, and it hasn't been resolved 2.5 years later. It needs to be resolved because let's understand when we talk about this how important this is. In the June storms of 2021, Sarah, who is involved at the Ferny Creek Sassafras CFA, her only way to communicate with the other CFA volunteers who were volunteering their lives was through a text message. But she had to leave her phone on the desk at the station and try and text, and sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't. And it's the middle of the night, and we are asking residents of our community to volunteer their time to keep us safe, and they do that willingly. But we need to give them the communications that they need and deserve for our emergency services. That is what they need. And so 2.5 years into the government, 2.5 years into the Albanese Labor government, we don't get a solution to those challenges, but we get a bill that makes no difference, a bill that does not improve the communications for the CFAs in my community, does not improve the communications for the residents of my community. We get a bill that is a stunt. It is a bill to allow the Prime Minister to distract from his failings yesterday, his character failings yesterday. And that's what it's about. And ultimately, this bill is so symbolic of the Albanese Labor government. It's all about spin, it's all about optics, but it's not about delivering for the Australian people. and you can spin for a little while, but after 2.5 years, the Australian people know they've been abandoned.
The bill be now read a second time. I give the call to member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Now, I'm the 5th person to speak on the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment Commitment to Public Ownership Bill. However, I'm only the 3rd one to talk about the NBN. The member for Casey and the member for Banks, incredible. Half an hour of my life that I'll never get back, having to listen to them, and they can't even spell NBN. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I mean, it reminded me. I'm actually old enough to remember that the member for Casey probably isn't, but we used to have this thing called where we dial up to get the internet. Your speeches were like that sound. I could just hear it in my head. Yeah, that when you didn't get through, it just like and it tried to get a connection, but it just didn't work. It didn't work because your horse and buggy copper is really last century. And unfortunately, the NBN needed to be of this century. Now, I was here in the 43rd Parliament. I've been around for a while. In fact, I ran for the election 20 years ago today. Got a second prize, but I see that Tony Burke, Chris Bowen, Justine Elliott and Steve Georgianis, I wish them all well for their 20-year anniversaries. But I remember what it was like in the 43rd Parliament and how a farmer called Tony Windsor, a farmer, a great man who served this country, understood the benefits of the NBN for farmers. He actually said this will be a benefit for the modern-day farmer, the modern-day miner, and for education, as the Prime Minister touched on, where every modern-day student is going to benefit from having a fibre network where they're sitting doing their homework, where they're at university, where they're sitting doing university work beside the Brisbane River, wherever it is, because that's what the NBN enables. So I just wanted to point out to the member for Casey and the member for Banks that this NBN is a national broadband network. Why is it national? Because we saw that we couldn't let the market do it. Prime Minister Rudd, a Queenslander, a Treasurer Swan, I think we particularly understood, because we come from a decentralised state where half of the people of Queensland live outside the southeast corner, those Queenslanders understood the benefits of that fibre network. And I will have a lot more to say. I know you all want to hear my speech, but I'll have a lot more to say about it later today.
Order. Order. Members can take their seats as quickly and as quietly as possible. The debate is interrupted in accordance with the resolution agreed to by the House on 11 September 2024 and varied on 9 October 2024. The debate may be resumed at a later hour.